Thank you all so much. Thank you, Dale, for taking the class last week. Appreciate it very, very much. Looked like it was a good discussion about Herod. What do you think? What do you think about Herod? How about that guy?
Cruel.
Yeah. They use the word "the great" pretty loosely there, don't they? Yeah, he was cruel.
Infamous.
Infamous. Yeah. What else? What else we pick up from that? Just a quick recap of Herod.
He built on his father, on top of his father. His father's one who promoted him and encouraged him.
Yeah.
What he is.
Yeah, exactly. That's the guy that had him all set up in the right place. And I was amazed when I studied that and watched that video and just studied about Herod, how much they were intertwined with the Romans by that point. I mean, he spent time in the Roman courts, and his father Antipater knew these guys, and they were all kind of close. They're out. I'm like, why? I think you even asked this in the class. Why were they so closely aligned with the Jews? And what was that all about? That's interesting. I never would have really thought that before you study it, that this little place, Judea, sitting here in the kind of way out, 1,000 miles away from Rome, was so closely aligned with Rome. So, very interesting. Getting pulled out. Uh-oh, you're in trouble. What we should do when we were in school and that happened? Remember that? I'm sure we'll see her again. The other else I think I remember from school, I don't know why I just can't remember the mimeograph paper? Remember when they
Yes.
Yes. I don't know why I just where was I? Oh, Herod and the Jews and the Romans so closely aligned together. Isn't that it's amazing. I mean, it's interesting. Is there a purpose there? We did talk a few weeks ago about where Judea was on the road map. That came up. Somebody mentioned that. I was watching the video. It came up. What about Judea? Why is it a special place?
Well, it's a neck-down area. Everybody had to pass through it, but it's close to the Egyptians too.
Yeah, it's you got the Egyptians down. The Egyptians are really remote. This is the way you can get to them over land. It is kind of a joint, It's a crucial place. You think about strategically. There's a lot that goes into that, And then there's places within places. You've heard of the Battle of Armageddon, there was a place called Megiddo, that was a valley, a kind of a choke point. I mean, so there was a lot of history there, and a lot of reason why that area was prosperous. And I was also kind of struck with how wealthy the Jews would become over time. Every time you turn around, somebody's taking 3,000 talents out of the temple. Like, where are they getting all this? Where's all this wealth coming from? Maybe it was trade and again on the ocean, on the sea there, and you get the wilderness to this side. So you kind of it's almost like a toll road. You had to go through that area. It was fought over for centuries. What else do you pick up from that? When you think about Herod the Great, what do you think about?
Evil, bad things.
Yeah.
All bad.
Yeah, all bad. As a Christian growing up, I just think of, that's not a good... I don't know if anybody ever named their kid Herod. Anybody do that? I'm not sure it's a name we've embraced, right? So not a good reputation, but... he was called Herod the Great, because of what he accomplished really architecturally and kingdom-wise. Yeah, Jim?
He was a great builder.
Yeah, he built a lot. That temple really was credited to him, and a lot of the fortresses around there were built by him that we're going to see here at the end of our story today, where the Jews finally hold out to the very end was probably an Herodian structure. So, so there was a lot to be said about this Herod guy. Now we know kind of where he came from. He came, we have a map here. They were Idumeans down this area. So the southern part of what would become his kingdom later on is where he was from. But we didn't really study this closely. But during the Hasmoneans, that area was taken over, and Judaism was compelled upon them. So they became Jews kind of because they got taken into that area. So he had grown up in a Jewish culture, but as we see, he wasn't Jewish really by lineage. But the Jewish religion and his family helped to give him some validity. So is that, whenever we read about Herod in the New Testament, is that who we're talking about?
No.
No. The term Herod actually is a family name. That it's kind of like when we talk about Herod, it's kind of like talking about President Bush. Which one are we talking about? right? President Roosevelt, which one are we talking about, right? President Adams, which one are we talking about, We talk about Kennedy, which Kennedy are we talking about? We're talking about the President Kennedy, his brother, the new Kennedy, right? So it's a family name, so we kind of see that happen. So what we're going to do, we're going to finish up our conversation today by understanding where this family went and what happened to them and how this whole story kind of closes out. We're going to see there is a definitive end to this whole story of the Jewish people, and I kind of use a timeline. If you think about it this way, the intertestamental period is basically this, right? But there's this lead up to it. We talked a lot about that. This is the Babylonian and Persian captivity, right? This is where the nation of Israel kind of ceases to exist. But there's some Old Testament writings about this. So we have this, right? And then what happens here? This is the New Testament, right? So we pick up right about here. We get a little bit of 4 BC here, 5 BC, but then it goes to a little bit of, let's say it does this. New Testament ends, I guess Revelation being the last book was written, what's the word? Revelation was probably written around 70 AD, maybe right before, probably right about here, right? But then there's some wind down and close out that basically can go out to about, say, 132 AD, where this is when it finally comes to an end. So there's a little bit of a wind down out here that's very interesting to learn about. So we're just going to touch on that today to understand. So if you look at the history, just from the Jewish perspective, right, this whole story starts out here about 600 BC. And ends somewhere-ish, 100-ish AD, something like that, when it ends. And this Jesus event happens right here towards the end. Towards the end of it. So I think, as we think about this today, and as you wander out from today, I hope you kind of think on this. It's like, what you can almost, in my mind, I can see this was the trigger to bring it to an end. And I think you're going to kind of see that. And I wish we could go on for weeks, because you'll see some subtle things that happen here that kind of trigger it to come to an end. So we're at this, right now we are sitting right about here, right? We are right here. We know that Herod the Great, we'll call him, HTG, he was born about, what do we say, about 60-something BC, dies about 4 BC, so dies right after Jesus is born. So he's right here. And so when the New Testament picks up, we see Herod is alive. It's toward the end of his reign. He dies in Jericho. You want to hear people get their just desserts here? He died of a very excruciatingly painful and putrefying illness. To the fact that he's known to have tried to take his own life a couple different times by stabbing, but it didn't work. It's interesting. But died a very painful death. And this is interesting. Josephus records that Herod, so he was not loved by the Jews. He was not embraced as a great leader by those people. In fact, he knew that towards the end. And Josephus records that he declared a law that he knew that when he died, no one would mourn his death, but he wanted mourning. This is how bad this guy is. So he ordered that a large group of distinguished people that everyone loved, like leaders of the church and leaders of the community, be gathered together and executed after he dies, so that there would be mourning. That's how bad this guy was. All right, so good to know that when he dies, nobody carries that out. Okay, but he declared that he had his close confidants swear that they would do that, so that there would be a terrible mourning in Israel when he died. So, give a little insight into who this guy was. It's got to understand now why he would go and kill these newborn or 2 years old in Bethlehem. You see why he would do that, right? It's the kind of guy we're talking about. So his brother-in-law Alexis and his sister did not carry that out. They were pretty much left in charge when he dies. So most scholarship puts his death right about 4 BC, and this is how we have come to reverse engineer and say this is where Jesus was born. So you remember when the Christians redid the calendar and tried to find year 1 based on Jesus' death, or BC's birth, they didn't have it quite right. So a lot of research and archaeology since then has put his death at about 4 BC. So that's what we know where Jesus was born, right about probably 5 to 4 BC, somewhere in there. So Caesar respected the term of Herod's will, which stipulated that his kingdom, this was his kingdom, it will be divided up amongst descendants and relatives of his. And so Herod had left a wish that his kingdom be broken up. So if we look at this is kind of interesting. This is Herod's kingdom. And you notice there's some areas where it kind of wraps around here. You ever read about the Decapolis? Decapolis? You read about that? What do we know about that?
10 cities.
What's that?
The cities, 10 cities.
10 cities? Yeah. 10 cities? 10 cities? Yeah. What else do we know about that? Who was out here? What was that? Yeah, John the Baptist was across the river. Yeah, up here. Yeah. This was mostly Greek. In fact, you'll see there's I think it's an account in Matthew where there's some of the followers go out there and raise up a stir. So the Decapolis was never part of Herod's kingdom. It was kind of it was non-Jewish area out there, so it wraps around that. But so this right here, if we see this land illustrated on this map, now this was the division of Herod's kingdom after he passes away. This is the state it's in by the time Jesus comes back and grows up. So this is what we're talking about. We've got Judea and Samaria down here. This becomes a little bit different. It's not an actual kingdom. It's Herod's son, Herod Archelaus, is made ethnarch of Judea and Samaria. Ethnarch, what's that sound like to you? Ethnarch. What could that be?
Sounds like aardvark to me, but I don't know.
Aardvark. What do you think? It is remember we talked a few weeks ago about we have these terms for ruler that are they're not king, they're not governor, they're authority in certain types of degrees. An ethnarch is a term that you gave someone who ruled over an ethnic peoples. So it said, your responsibility is these people, this ethnic group. So who do you think the ethnic group is down here? The Jews, yeah, in Judea here, right? So he becomes Herod Archelaus, there's another Herod, becomes the ethnarch of Judea, Samaria, and Idumea for a few years. Augustus judged this guy to be pretty incompetent. We won't get into everything he did, but he was a disaster. He failed to maintain control when he had a lot. Remember, if you're the Jews and Herod's dead, what is going to be your tendency now? Herod's dead.
So you can let people know you're a Jew.
Well, I mean, but what?
Celebrate.
Remember, they came out of the Hasmonean. They were somewhat independent. Herod takes over. We don't like Herod. He dies.
Celebrate.
Say that again. Well, but if you're the Jewish people, what's going to be your
Freedom.
Yeah, freedom, right? This is our chance to get our country back. And so the Romans say, no. We're going to put one of Herod's guys over those people down there and lock it down. We're not going to make you king. We're just going to you're going to have control over them. So they get locked down again, right? They don't get their freedom again. This province is enlarged by the prefects or by the Romans until about 41 AD. So right at about 41 AD. So now that's right after Jesus' death. This area then becomes pretty much what we see there, this Judean province. And Herod's other son, he's got a couple sons, Herod Antipas, have we heard of him? Who is that? Who is Herod Antipas? And lots of Herods here. Who's Herod Antipas? He's famous. We read about him. We're right here now. We're right about here in our journey. So again, now we're spilling over here to Christ. Herod Antipas is the Herod we read about at the time of Jesus' crucifixion. He's the one that had John the Baptist beheaded. Okay? So this is Herod Antipas. He becomes, at Herod the Great's death, he becomes Tetrarch of Galilee and Perea. So that's this area right up here. Galilee here, the purple. And from Herod's death till about 39. So he only stays in control there for a few years. It's funny, very funny. Archelaus, the first guy down here, and Antipas end up just during this whole time, Jesus is coming along, all the kind of the turmoil that's happening there, they lose control. And Augustus, actually by this time it's Tiberius, yanks Antipas out and sends him to exile in Gaul. So he didn't get killed, but he just gets, and so Archelaus gets sent to exile in Gaul too. Gaul is like the place, it's like the Siberia of the day. You know, if you're the Romans, you're going to send somebody someplace where they're not going to kill you, but I'm going to send you off someplace where you'll never be heard from again. Gaul. What is France today? It was like putting you on a boat to Australia. You know, that was where he sent them to. So this is how Antipas comes into power. He gets given this area of Galilee up here when Herod dies, and so we know that he comes to story, you know, a few times there in the New Testament, dealing with John the Baptist. You know, again, Jesus gets sent to Herod, right? So we see him coming in now. That's Herod Antipas. And that's how he comes to control Galilee. He loses Galilee, and actually every time that one of these Herodian guys loses something, the Romans just absorb it. The Romans just say, all right, I'm just going to take it on, enough messing with these local monarchs. So I'm just going to make it a province and put it under a prefect, and we'll just kind of assimilate it into the Roman way. So we can see early on when the Romans first come in here, back under the Hasmoneans, back under the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, they tended to leave this area alone. They tended to kind of leave the Jews, leave the religion alone. But what happens as a result of doing that? What's the story?
They rebel.
Rebellion. It's a constant rebellion, right? It's either they fight amongst themselves or they try to push the Romans out. So even though they were kind of left alone to do their thing, like the Persians did, right? And the Greeks to some extent left them alone for the most part. By this point, they're just really stirred up, and every chance they get, they kind of light it up again. So as that becomes more and more tumultuous, the Romans just one by one kind of eliminate these monarchs and just absorb it in to the Roman Empire as a province. So there's another son named Philip. He becomes tetrarch of these lands east of the Jordan, so he becomes tetrarch of this area over here. Remember, the Romans have taken all this over, so his two sons, Antipas and Philip, get control of those lands after his death. This Archelaus guy that took over Judea, he ends up just being just as cruel, probably even more so than his father. And it's thought that, okay, so Jesus is born about 5 to 4 BC, something like that. What's the story? Jesus is born, what happens?
He gets sent to Egypt.
Why does he go to Egypt?
Because Herod's out to kill all the 2-year-old and others.
Herod hears that there's a new king of the Jews born. He figures out where he's at. I'm going to go kill all the young boys during this time. So Jesus' parents take him to Egypt, right? Mm-hmm. Herod dies very soon after that. So he doesn't live very long after that. He's probably in this crazy state that we talked about earlier, right about here. So what did Joseph and Mary do? What's it say they do? Anybody remember?
They returned.
Where do they return to, though?
Nazareth.
Nazareth. Where's Bethlehem?
Yeah.
Bethlenem's here, right? In Judea.
Mm-hmm.
Where's Nazareth?
Galilee.
Galilee. Why doesn't he go back to Bethlehem? Why don't they go back here? This is where their family's from. Remember
There's another Herod's involved.
Yeah, so this guy. So Herod the Great dies. Herod Archelaus comes in. If you read that in Matthew, it says we were still concerned about Herod or whatever, so we didn't go there. We went to Nazareth. This Archelaus guy was probably as bad or worse than his dad was. So they know this. The word gets around. They figure out we're not going to go back here again. We're going to get up here to Galilee, where this different guy is in control, who we're not hearing bad things about. And that's how they end up in Galilee. You ever wondered how they ended up there? That's how they did. Because Herod Antipas is in control of that big purple blob to the north there, and he's not near as bad as his brother or his dad. So, kind of interesting, isn't it? How do these people end up where they're at? Like, how does this happen? Again, we kind of pop the scriptures open in the New Testament. Where did these people come from? Who were they? What's the history? Why are they doing what they're doing? Imagine the geopolitics of that, right? Well, these people lived that. They knew who these people were. That the news went around of what these people were doing and what they were capable of. But just a couple years later, though, this Archelaus guy gets deposed. I mean, because he's so bad that he gets the Augustus Caesar is still in power in Rome. He pulls him out, sends him to Gaul, and that's when it turns into just a province at that point. So now as Jesus grows up and starts his ministry, he can now wander. Remember, there's lots of going back and forth, right? They go to Jerusalem, they wander around Judea there. So now it becomes open. We talked about this very early on. What did the Romans bring for the gospel to be able to spread? What are some of the things they provide?
Roads,
and what else?
Language.
Oh, come
No, we're not using Latin. That's for a few hundred years.
Or using Greek.
What do they bring?
The Pax Romana.
The Pax Romana. Yeah. You see it happening here now. Pax Romana, the Roman peace. When the Romans aren't in charge, it's chaos. It's kind of chaos, isn't it? You got babies getting killed, you got people burning, starving to death in prison. It's chaos. When the Romans come, they say, lock this place down. This is nuts. Right? So now when they come in and lock it down, we can actually move around now. We can get down to Jerusalem. If this Archelaus guy was still in power, Jesus couldn't have gone to Jerusalem. Right? I mean, so these were separate kingdoms too. You couldn't really pass between them very well. So this Pax Romana is huge, especially not just now, but for the 600 years or so that it's going to last, 300 years. You can move around. You can traverse the empire. If they have control over everything and it's peaceful, this is my harvest ground now. This whole empire, I can move around. Thoughts about that? Takeaways.
But they still kept the Herods in power. But they basically said to him, as long as you behave.
Yeah, I mean, remember Herod the Great's...
Because Agrippa was the last Herod, right?
Which one?
Agrippa.
Agrippa. We're going to talk about
was the
Agrippa.
last Herod.
We're going to talk about Agrippa, yeah. Hang tight, we're not to Agrippa yet.
Okay.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is they still kept their leaders in place.
Yeah, they tried to, because remember this Antipater guy, Herod the Great's father, was real tight with
That's right.
with Augustus.
Okay.
Remember that? He was in really tight with Rome.
But even though they locked it down, they still kept their leaders in place.
They kept they kept this initial wave, but then remember Augustus dies, Tiberius becomes the emperor.
Okay.
He doesn't really know these Herod guys very well. I'll kind of keep it in place until it just continues to turn into chaos, and these guys don't know how to behave themselves, right? And in fact, I think it was Augustus made a comment publicly that you'd be better off being Herod's pet pig than one of his brothers or sons. That's how bad this guy was. So they knew who they were dealing with, but as long as they behaved themselves and locked down and didn't cause too much trouble, we'll leave them there. But once you start chaos and incompetence, then they get pulled out and sent away. And that's what happens to Archelaus down here. That ends up happening to
I have a dumb question. So did the Romans speak Greek then too? Were they more Greek?
Greek was there, yeah. I mean, look, Latin was their language, but these peoples they conquered, Greek was very prevalent.
And did they, when they came in at the time of Christ, were they speaking Greek or were they speaking Latin? Or
I think Latin was primarily the language, but
Okay.
Greek was everywhere. It was the international language. If you think about it, you'd had 300 years for Greek to be kind of permeated, but this Roman thing happens pretty fast.
right?
So they're not. In fact, I think we talked this a while ago too that they didn't impose Latin across the kingdom like the Greeks did. Yes, sir.
When Jesus was crucified, they had the sign written in 3 languages.
Yeah, it was Aramaic, Latin, and Greek.
Was okay.
Yeah. So good questions. Yeah, I mean, but I kind of look at it like the Roman occupation and conquer happens so fast. It happens like in 150 years, just poof, really quick, way quicker than that. What's that?
That's quick.
Pretty quick. I mean, in ancient times, we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years, right? And thousands of years. So we have these couple terms. Ethnarch, that's a ruler over an ethnic peoples. In other words, you are responsible for these people, right? A tetrarch, you heard of that? The tetrarch. The tetrarch was a term for you're in charge of a quarter of something. So if you look at this land here, besides the yellow, we see 4 quarters, right? If we go back and look at this original, this pink here, divide that up into 4 quarters. See it? See the 4 quarters? 1, 2, 3, 4. So you were made a tetrarch over one of those quarters. So now you're responsible for a region or a land. So these terms have different meanings. So when you see the term tetrarch, that's what he's talking about. You've got this quarter. Ethnarch, you've got these people. Make sense? Great. It's very different than the way we function today, but it's very interesting to understand where these terms came from when we read about it. So Herod Antipas, we know, up there in Galilee, he drew the ire of John the Baptist, right? We know what happens to him. So Herod Agrippa then becomes king of Judea and the surrounding areas after Antipas is deposed by Rome. So remember, the New Testament, there's lots of little, it'd be great to make a illustration of this. There's lots of little segments here happening, right? So you've got the New Testament, the New Testament's covering quite a bit, right? From, Luke 1, basically, through the end of Acts, figure the historical part, and even we read about some in the writings, the epistle letters, we see that spilling over here, and there's lots going on, right? We see the Herods changing. Where does Herod Agrippa come from? Where do we read about Herod Agrippa? Anybody know? Where does Herod Agrippa pop up? Yeah, another Herod.
So, when the pilot sent Jesus to Herod Agrippa?
That was Herod Antipas.
Antipas.
That's Herod Antipas. Right? Herod Agrippa is in Acts 12. Anybody want to turn over to Acts 12? If you got a Bible, flip over to Acts 12. What happens in Acts 12?
Paul's arrested.
Peter's arrested. Peter's in jail. So if we read at the beginning of Acts 12 here, it was about this time that King Herod arrested some who belonged to the church, intending to persecute them. So this is now after Jesus' death. So if we say this is going to be, let's put it right about here, right? Jesus' death. Let's call it 33. We're not sure that's right, but somewhere in here, 23. So it's after this, right? This Herod Agrippa guy now is in charge. So now we see the transitions come over. He had James, the brother of John, put to death with a sword. We saw this met with approval with the Jews. He succeeded to seize Peter also. This happened during the festival of unleavened bread. So down to verse 6. The night before Herod was to bring the trial, Peter was sleeping, right? We see all this. This is the Herod that's talking about here. This is Herod Agrippa. That's this guy. Okay? So again, lots of Herods here. So we see kind of the same general behavior, right? He's putting the apostles to death now, the disciples to death. He is somehow involved in the persecution of the church.
My Wikipedia says he was, at 6, he was taken to Rome to learn.
Yeah.
And his best friend was Caligula.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, that's when these guys were really tight with some pagan.
Caligula was totally insane.
Yeah, he was
so
morally bankrupt.
he got away,
Yeah.
He did the same.
Yeah, so we saw this Antipater guy who Herod the Great's dad was really tight with the Romans, and so his children and his descendants all were, still had this Roman connection. What else do we learn about Agrippa? I think this is later on in the same chapter.
Eaten by worms.
Died
Yeah,
of worms.
yeah, down in verse 20, Herod's death. All right, so now he's doing this stuff. He's persecuting the Jews, the apostles. Some of the Jews approve. We read about that. Okay, Peter gets away. Verse 20. He had been quarreling with the people of Tyre and Sidon. Where's that? That's up here in Phoenicia. That's not even in his kingdom. All right, that's in Phoenicia. They now joined together and saw an audience of them after securing the sport. Verse 21, on the appointed day, Herod, wearing his royal robe, sat on his throne, delivered a public address to the people. They shouted, "This is the voice of God, not a man." Have we seen this before? We've seen this before. Verse 23, immediately, because Herod did not give praise to God, an angel of the Lord struck him down. He was eaten by worms and died. But the word of God continued to spread and flourish. Immediately. That's interesting. Anything that sent a little bit of a shockwave through? So that's the Herod we're talking about. That's Herod Agrippa. Again, he got control of this. because Antipas and Archelaus had kind of botched things. And so after Agrippa's death, his son was given succession to the throne, but so there's a succession that happens, but at this point Rome has kind of had enough. We're getting anybody know what happens here? Jerusalem's destroyed in 70 AD. We are getting dangerously close to this now. We are creeping along here, right? Why does Rome destroy Jerusalem? Anybody know why? Too much rebellion, too much trouble, too much pushback, too much revolt. It's getting dangerously close to that. We see the leaders are incompetent. The leaders, are they part of the problem here? At this point, Rome just says, no, there is no succession. We're going to turn this into a province. So now, all of Judea and Galilee become a province. And this basically caused them to give up hope for independence for about 20 years. In about 20 years now, it's gonna break back up again. So that takes us almost through the history of the New Testament there, and who these different Herods are, where they came from, and what do we mean when we read Herod? When we read about Herod, there's basically 4 different Herods. There's Herod the Great, that was when Jesus was born. That was the killing of the innocents. Herod Archelaus took over this area. That's the one that Joseph and Mary avoided on the way back. He's gone after a couple of years. Herod Antipas is the Herod that kills John the Baptist and that Jesus is brought before. That's Herod Antipas. And then Herod Agrippa was the guy who tried to stamp out Christianity and dies eaten by worms in Acts 12. So those are the 4 Herods that we really read about in the New Testament. Yeah? Thoughts, questions? Oof. That's like, imagine having like 4 President Bushes, trying to keep them all straight. Which one was that now? Is that the 90s? Is that 2000? Which president are we talking about, right? It's the same idea. We're trying to keep all these family names straight, right? Who is that? All right, so we are now winding down. A revolt breaks out in Jerusalem in 66 AD against the Roman prefect. Basically had to do with the Romans demanding funds from the temple. That's essentially what caused it. And so a revolt breaks out. This just goes nowhere but bad. The Roman garrison's overwhelmed. This is in 66. There's just a garrison holding out here. They get overwhelmed. But now the emperor, who's the emperor now? Do we know?
Nero.
Nero is now the emperor in Rome. So he doesn't know the connection with Tiberius and Augustus and all these things that have happened. He says, that's it, done, wipe the place out. So he sends an army in there to put down the revolt. He sends this General Vespasian down to put it out. Gets there about 68, so it takes him 2 years to get there from Rome. Right? You're not just going to hop on a C5 and fly over there, right? You're going to have to basically walk or take a boat. And for most of the summer, quells Galilee, all the area to the north there. This revolt is kind of spread out. Imagine the Jews are looking at, hey, this is our chance, right? The Herods are gone again. This is our chance. We can have our nation back. They want to restructure that. The Romans come down, quell all the revolt up there in the north, and just keep moving down towards Jerusalem down here in the south. And by late 69, early 70, they arrive at the city, and this just turns into total and utter chaos. If you want to read some very interesting and also kind of depressing stuff, read about what happened there. At this point, imagine you've had hundreds of years of frenzy kind of built up amongst the Jews on what should we be? Should we be religious zealots? Should we be, Hellenized? Should we be Roman? What should we be? And some really intense, extreme factions had built up by this point. We read about the zealots. We've been talking about the zealots. The zealots now are a faction, are almost like a political force. And so within the walls of Jerusalem, they pull back as the Romans are coming. The Romans essentially surround the city. It's like they're eating their own inside the city. I mean, it's bad what happens in there. There's a group called the Zealots and a group called the Sicarii. So the Zealots and I'm going to spell this right. Say C-A-R-R-I. Say C-A-R-R-I. high. These are the two kind of extreme groups fighting for control and influence. And they just, basically, these two groups take over, they create anarchy by trying to lock the place down. And anybody inside the city who says we should have peace with the Romans is basically killed. So it's like, nobody for peace in here. We want total war and destroy the Roman occupiers. You know what the bad news is about this, really? This was right about the time of Passover. And so the city had been flooded with people coming to the city for Passover and got trapped there in the middle of this. Because you couldn't I'm gonna catch an airplane and fly out. I mean, if you're on your way, you might not know, and you get there, and I want to go back, it's a Roman army, I turn around and I go back, and it just turns into chaos. So you've got all these innocent people who had nothing to do with revolt stuck in the city, and you've got these two factions here fighting over extremism, and there were people trying to, hey, let's have a truce with the Romans. We don't want, this is going to go bad. These guys would kill you if you even openly suggested that. So bad that there was huge food supply. Jerusalem was a fortress city. Okay, so it was meant to hold out for a very long period of time. They had food stocks. They could have lasted a long time. These guys burned the food supply. This is like Cortez burning his ships type of thing. There ain't no going back. There's only forward, right? So you burn the food supply. There is no lasting for 3 or 4 years. You're going to have to fight your way out of here or destroy it. That's how bad this got. Total, absolute chaos in there. The Romans dig a trench. People were trying to sneak out through the sewers, through tunnels, secret tunnels, trying to get out of the city. And some of them were getting away, and the Romans knew some people were getting away. They dug a ditch, a big, huge trench, all the way around the city. And the dirt they took out of the trench made a wall. So you had this huge wall mound in a ditch completely surrounding the city. And anybody that got out got caught in this ditch, got caught in this thing. And the Romans would crucify them on the hill. I mean, it was chaos. Total, absolute chaos. The Jews, it is ending badly right here. And some good news is by this point the Christians had gotten out. Before this even happened, when the uprising all this started, or about 66 to 68, the Christian disciples, the people who were not in favor of this Jewish nation thing, got out of there. Most of them had been gone by now. Who was left was the people that were happy about James being killed. You can kind of look at it that way. This is who was left. And so it was just a very, very bad thing. Eventually, in 70 AD, the Romans break in. They breach the walls. A fire starts. It's debatable about who started the fire. I think maybe some defenders started the fire to stop the Romans. Then the fire got out of control, and basically the entire city either burns or gets destroyed. You can still see, if you go on and Google this, you can still see boulders turned over when the Romans burst through. They're still there. You can see where the walls have been completely torn down. So the defenders pulled back into the temple. That was eventually overran and completely destroyed. They pulled into two places, either the temple or Herod's palace, and they were both eventually destroyed and burned down. So this is how the Jewish temple eventually gets completely destroyed, is the Jews fighting to the death. This wasn't, somebody came in and wiped it out. It's like they burned their food supplies. All there was a fight to the death. It was crazy. Do we see extremism like that today? Do we see that? We think about it. We read about this kind of stuff. We think, well, people can't possibly act that way. Martyrdom, just complete, total. These people have been brought up into just a frenzy by this point, and anybody who voiced moderation was killed. So who are you left with? The crazies, or the extreme zealots. This is how we're going to go down, right? We're not going to give in again. This pagan society, and so that's what happens. So Jerusalem is completely destroyed in 70 AD. Some remote outposts especially down here along the Dead Sea and around here, hold out for a few more years. Anyone ever hear of Masada?
Yeah.
So Masada was a mountaintop, mountaintop plateau fortress, considered impenetrable. You had to basically climb up a mountain hand over hand to get up there. And so there's a group that held out there till about 73. And if you ever read about that, it's very interesting. The Romans just said, all right, we're going to build
ramp.
Yeah.
Build a
the
ramp. Just
That's right.
basically slave labor, essentially, right? If you weren't killed, you were forced to dig and build this ramp. And when they broke into the fortress, I think 3 people or 6 people were alive. The rest of them all killed
They said
themselves.
that they were not the zealots, I think they were the Sakari too.
Could
They
have been
were
Sakari,
the
yeah.
off branch of
Yeah.
that group.
Yeah.
And they literally killed all themselves
Yeah.
instead of being captured.
The ones that either got out or weren't trapped in the city. So this brought the first Jewish-Roman war to an end. Notice it's the first Jewish-Roman war. What do you think of that? The second one. So about 132 AD, a second war breaks out. So now we're talking about 50 years later. So we're out here, right? About 50 years. Christ's been gone now for 100 years. Jerusalem's been destroyed for 50 years. Another war breaks out. The Sanhedrin somehow had survived this, and they attempted to establish another independent state again. Remember, you've got now multiple Roman rulers coming along, and that revolt was crushed in 135, and the result was a level of destruction and death that has really been described as genocide. The Romans just at this point said, we are going to eliminate the Jewish people as a people, and as religion, and just really tried to stamp it out. To the point that by 137, the nation was completely eliminated, and this wasn't to the point that, remember, this Judea had been a Roman province. They changed the name. The term Judea goes away, and they named it Syria Palestina, and that's where the word Palestine. You ever wonder how we got that today? So you're talking about 132 AD. The Romans finally called it Palestine after this attempt to completely eradicate the Jews. Do you want to drag some history back a couple thousand years? Yep.
Who was the Caesar at that time?
This was Hadrian.
Okay,
Hadrian is now the Caesar at this point. Emperor.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and also what's happened, this has been so extreme that by this point, Jews in the attempt to survive were fleeing Roman control. This is how they get up in places outside of Rome, like up into maybe the Russian steppe and into places way outside, down into Africa and east. This is how the Jews and maybe the Christians got way outside of Roman. This idea that if there's a puddle of water and I do this, bang! What's the puddle of water do? It goes everywhere, right? So we've talked a lot in our story here about God's instruments, right? Do we see more instruments being used? Yeah, to push it out. Yes.
Built roads that a lot of the Christians are escaping.
To get away on, yeah, get away on the roads. Yeah, and cross countryside where they don't know what's going on down here. It's peaceful. I can make my way out across the border. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, good point. So that's the stories. That brings to end the story of the nation of Israel for about an 1,800-year period of time. Had been established in Egypt around 1100 or so BC. Fought for a homeland under Joshua. Established a kingdom under Saul and David. Split into 2 kingdoms after Solomon's death. The northern kingdom goes off into permanent Assyrian captivity around 700 BC, so we're out here about 700 or so. No, I'm sorry, back here, about 700 or so. This is where the northern kingdom disappears. Judah, the southern kingdom, goes into Babylonian captivity about 590, permanent, or about 600 permanent Babylonian captivity around 590. Jews come home about 540, become a Persian province until the Greeks come in. Greeks come in around 330 BC, become their own kingdom again in 140 BC, become a Roman province. Herods come in, Jesus is born, Jesus dies, disciples, apostles go out, chaos happens, Israel ends about 132. That's the story of Israel in 13 weeks. What do you think? I'm exhausted. What do you think? What's the lesson? Is there a lesson? Or is there something to be learned?
The pain from that whole scene was amazing.
Amazing.
Because
my parents are immigrants from Italy. My father could speak Jewish. And they go all the way back to the 1800s when these immigrants started coming into this country. You would not believe the pain that these people talked about from that point to today.
They lost their country, lost their kingdom, their nation. Imagine if Americans, we grow up, and if we lost our nation, how we would pass that story on to generations, right? How we look back at our heritage and our language and our writings. Yeah.
But interwoven through that whole story, you see God's hand.
Yeah.
You know, when things are going so bad, and there was a change of power. Jesus couldn't have done what he did if that wasn't an open area for him to go through.
Right.
So
yeah, it couldn't have. Jesus, I mean, could have done anything, but it was perfectly set up to work through mankind. I feel also too, as bad as things were, he always gave his people a way out, or a way of redemption, you know, or a way of escape. You know, that was always there. It seemed like the bad stuff was a lot of times happened to ones who just dug their heels in and were stubborn and followed the ways of the world rather than God's ways.
Well, God's telling that us today. He
Yeah.
gave us all this so we could see that there will always be a way.
Right, it's always a way out.
Always be a way out. There's always a way.
So I appreciate you hanging with us for 13 weeks to study the Intertestamental Period. I hope it helped answer some questions to you and maybe raise some more questions that you can answer through study and on your own. There's lots of information, lots of good stuff out there to research and learn about. So thanks for being a great class.
yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. See you guys next time.
Okay.
Thank you.